Good afternoon. Happy New Year. This is Lisa Guthrie. I'm the Executive Director of VTA. I want to thank everybody who's participating today to learn more about the pending changes to the State Transit Funding Program. I want to offer a special thank you to our TSDEC representatives, Brian Smith from HRT and Kate Mattice with NVTC. Brian put together this presentation, but unfortunately has to send his regrets that he's under the weather and unable to participate today. Kate will be presenting our webinar, so thank you for that, Kate. All participants are muted for the webinar, but we want to receive your questions. So you can type them in at any point. At the end of all the presentations, we'll answer your questions that have been typed in, and here's how to do that. Look for the webinar panel on your screen and simply type in your question into the question box. Although they will be answered at the end of the webinar, you can submit them at any time and we'll hold on to them. Remember that you're muted, so we'll be unable to hear you during the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the VTA website under the Presentations tab in a few days. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Mattice, and I'm with the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. And as Lisa said, I've been participating on the Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee with DRPT through this process. And so both Brian and I have had the opportunity to be sitting and a part of the discussions as DRPT creates these various proposals. So just to give you a little bit of background of what has happened to the State Transit Capital Program, there was one big legislative package that came through this past January, well, I should say, sorry, this past General Assembly session, HB 1539, SB 856, that really did look at changing the way the Department of Rail and Public Transit allocates its transit funding. They specifically did carve out some things for the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. They have lots of their own conditions associated with that. But then they also talked about the state capital program, state operating assistance, and then, of course, allocation to some of their special programs. So what we're going to talk about today is a very quick recap of sort of how the state is addressing the capital program, because they were required to put in a new prioritization framework. This part has already been voted on. And then we'll spend a little bit more time talking about the move to 100% performance-based funding for operating assistance. So let me just dive in very quickly to the capital prioritization proposal that has actually already gone through CTB. A lot of words on this page, but really wanted to focus on the Commonwealth recognized that capital projects really come in a small number of different types, one of which is the state of good repair, which actually they identified about 80% of the funding that DRPT provides for capitals for state of good repair. But then also there was a recognition for expansion. In particular, the legislation calls out major expansion. And for state of good repair, and I'll talk about this in just a minute, state of good repair was supposed to be based upon asset management principles. I know many transit agencies are working on the Federal Transit Administration asset management things, so this is very much aligned with those. As it came to major expansion, the legislation said that you had to do an analysis to determine those projects, and they were to be considered using factors that look an awful lot like, in fact, these factors themselves are identical to SmartScale. Now, and I've got one more chart on this, but the reality is this is already in place for the funding for this coming year. The applications that each of your transit agencies are putting in right now for capital will be under this new system. So just moving to the next slide is just a really quick highlight. Again, you really want to go and look at DRPT's guidance on this. But the big changes to the capital program are really in these three different areas, one of which is the idea of tiers being a different amount of state share, funding share that would be towards different types of assets is what it was moving into this new fiscal year. There's no more tiers. What there's going to be is you're either going to apply for state of good repair, you're going to apply for a minor enhancement, which is effectively a small capital project that isn't about state of good repair, but it's not quite a brand new line, which is really what the major capital projects. And as mentioned, the third one, again, the major capital projects. So those are the different three things to be applying for under the capital program. The match rates themselves, DRPT proposed and CTB accepted that you could get up to 68% of state funding for the state of good repair and minor expansion. And for major capital projects, the state would provide up to 50% No matter what, in all situations, there would be a minimum of 4% required by the localities. So you actually could use, of course, federal money for any of the non-state, non-local match. The other thing, which I think really permeates all of this is now an application-driven program. So there are scoring, ranking, prioritization for all of the capital projects that are funded under DRPT. And as I mentioned before, State of Good Repair is looking at asset management principles, which are things like age and condition of assets, but then also how much those assets touch service and the operations of that transit system. Same thing for minor expansion. It's very much how those things are touching the service of that system. And for major capital projects, it's using some modified smart scale factors that are focused on transit. So again, super teaser on all of this, but DRPT has already implemented this. They're already moving forward. So there's lots of good information on the DRPT website for the capital program. Next slide. The other thing that was new within this legislation was that transit agencies with more than 20 vehicles in their bus fleet would be required to do new strategic plans. So just ever so briefly on this, as I mentioned, it's going to be urbanized areas with a population of over 50,000 and have a bus fleet of at least 20 buses, and that each of these transit agencies would need to develop sort of an enhanced TDP, a strategic plan, at least once every 5 years. This, again, is just like the capital, has already been in place and approved by CTB. And for implementation, on the next slide, this basically gives the overview of which transit agencies are required to do this and when they're required to do it. Hopefully all of you that are looking at any of these transit agencies are already familiar with this, but this is something that's already starting to go into place and will be phased in for various updates using this schedule. Now, the bulk of this presentation is really about the changes to the operating assistance program. Mostly because I think this might be the first time since the VTA board meeting late last year when VTAs had a chance to sort of share this with all of you. So in particular, the legislation did do an allocation, as we showed at the beginning, of the funds from DRPT. But what they put in was that the operating costs of transit providers need to be distributed based on service delivery factors, and those need to be based on effectiveness and efficiency as established by the Commonwealth Transportation Board. And it does also say that can be revisited. So, so this is something that there's been a lot of work, a lot of intense work by DRPT consultants in consultation with TSDAC to figure out. This is something that is currently out for comment by DRPT, and we just confirmed its comment period ends on February 3rd. So this is really timely right now to understand what this means for your own transit agency and what comments you may want to provide. You could to the Commonwealth Transportation Board at their meeting later this month, or providing written comment to DRPT during this open period of time. So just moving to the next slide. So when we look how things are currently allocated versus what is being proposed, and understanding what's being proposed using these delivery factors is something that's in the code. So it has to be done. The question is how should it be done? But just looking at how things are currently is all the transit agencies get a base of funding from DRPT, and then any additional funding that was provided, I think it's after 2013, should be based on performance. This is now moving all 100% of DRPT operating funding to be using performance factors. And so what DRPT had done before and are doing again is really a two-step process to it. One is basically determining sort of how big is a transit agency, so sort of how much scale of money should they be getting, versus performance, which is a situation when you're talking about, as I suggest, your passengers per revenue hour. So that's more of a thing that can change over time or what have you. So there's really two parts to it, which is a size and weight, and then a performance allocation. And so this is what DRPT has been working and checking in with TSDAC over the last 3 or 4 months to move forward. So now I'm going to jump into a couple of flow charts that hopefully aren't too confusing. So this is currently what is going on. As I mentioned, the operating funds, there's a bucket of what they're referring to as traditional funding, and then there's a bucket for performance-based funding. And it really is, it's about the operating expenses and the funding available is the good lion's share of all this. And then there's a little bit of tweaking done based on some different metrics over on the right side for performance-based funding. But if you look to the right, you'll see under performance-based funding, sizing and performance adjustments. Keep an eye on those because that's what all of the money for operating will now be allocated with some tweaks to what the different sizing metrics are and the performance adjustments are. So if we go to the next slide, this is where it all starts to play out. So the proposed methodology by DRPT that is sitting and waiting for public comment looks at allocating all of the funds. First of all, the first step of sizing, where a transit agency, the DRPT will look to the transit agency's operating cost, ridership, revenue vehicle hours, and revenue vehicle miles to set up sort of a base allocation. And then something that would be changing or allow for tweaking is some performance. So how well is that transit agency performing compared to others, where they'd look at passengers over revenue vehicle hours, passengers over revenue vehicle miles, operating costs per revenue vehicle hours, operating costs per revenue vehicle mile, and operating costs per passenger. So those 5 performance adjustments would be put on top. Now, one of the things that DRPT found when they did these different scenarios and ran the numbers is that that there was some places where things were getting a little bit skewed in terms of perhaps even historically how much percentage of state funding was being used for operating. And if you tweak this around, could potentially give certain transit agencies all of a sudden get a 100% bump, doubling of their DRPT operating funds. Now, of course, I'm sure we'd all be happy to be the recipients of somebody receiving double the state funds. But what was also happening is that a number of transit agencies were also seeing significant cuts in their operating funds. So DRPT found that if you look to limiting the amount of state funding for operating assistance to 30%, that actually evened things out a little bit better. Transit agencies still, and we'll see this a little bit later, a vast majority of transit agencies do see additional operating assistance from DRPT, and those who have losses, DRPT was trying to mitigate those a little bit. So that would basically lead to the proposed allocation per agency. Now, if we go to the next slide, as I mentioned before, there are winners and losers. And in particular, there's a couple of losers that lose pretty badly, between 10 and 15%, I believe, of their operating assistance that they would be getting from DRPT. So one of the things that was proposed and is part of this package is that for next year, there would be a slight modification in the sizing metrics. And by doing so, you'd actually get a smoother transition to these new factors, especially for those who are seeing significant cuts. So to look to this one, it's changing operating costs from 50% to 60%. And that is where there would be some modifications and modifying ridership from 30% down to 20%. And DRPT is proposing that would be a single year of transition. And then by 2021, you'd go to the methodology noted above. So, as I said, by doing so, some of the transit agencies that saw significant losses would see a little bit of a glide path to as you go down to 50% operating costs. So if we go to the next slide, it just really speaking to next steps. In a minute, we can show you sort of how the funding appears to be playing out as a comparison to 2019. But in terms of understanding the timeline and expectations, the draft policy is out for a 45-day comment period. It started on December 20th. It finishes on February 3rd. And the CTB intends to be adopting this policy at their February meeting. One of the things that TSDAC proposed but was not implemented as a part of the package that DRPT moved forward on was perhaps having a 2-year transition period. Instead of going from 60% of operating costs, then immediately to 50% of operating costs, that maybe you could do a 60, then a 55, and then a 50. So this is something that the TSDAC body did propose, effectively a 2-year transition. DRPT did not accept that recommendation and is moving forward. But I think it really comes down to an understanding of how the money plays itself out. And I know this webinar will be available afterwards, which might be very helpful. But if we go to the next slide, and it's actually the following 2 slides, and it's going to be hard because we're on a webinar here. But this basically demonstrates if you were to take 2019 and run it through this new approach, what would be the difference? And as you can see with those noted in red, those are the transit agencies that if, again, you ran last year's numbers with a new allocation approach, these are the ones that would lose funding. And the ones in black are the ones that would see a growth. And so it's actually this slide, and if you want to, Jamie, quickly go to the next slide, we can get sort of a teaser. So these are all the transit agencies that were identified, and we can actually maybe hold here for a second and then go back up again, Jamie. But as you can see, a lot of transit agencies do okay, but there are some that see some significant losses. And so that is something that DRPT was mindful of in the rollout of this this new methodology. I do want to caveat the numbers that are on here are not about FY20. These are not precise numbers. These are calculated numbers based upon last year. So I just want to have caution. This is not something somebody can budget to. But I think, I know I kind of went through this really quickly, but that's really the highlights of everything. Again, this is a DRPT proposal. They did take input from TSDAC, of which Brian Smith and I sit on, but I will do my best to answer questions, but some of these may be questions we're going to forward over to DRPT. With that, I think we can just go to the questions.
All right, I'm looking at questions. I don't see anything yet. Could you take a moment, Kate, while we're waiting for some questions to come in, to go back to the flow chart possibly and show that that VRE did have a different calculation on that?
Oh, absolutely. And so if slide 16 or 15 is either one is fine. So one of the things that was identified early in the process, and this is actually, this is something that we talked about throughout the discussions with TSDAC, is that transit agency, different types of transit within the Commonwealth have different characteristics, and that this is really what DRPT is being asked to do is a very difficult thing to do, because a demand response service versus an urban, fixed route service, or even a college town service, they're all very different. And so it's something I'll tell you within TSDAC, we had a lot of conversation about how you can have a single set of metrics for all these different types of services. And that's something I in particular was focused a lot on. And there was some hesitation to go probably as far as I would have wanted to go, which was really recognize a number of different types of transit, like perhaps the Federal Transit Administration does in the way it allocates its funding. That said, there was a case made, and DRPT wanted to identify that the operating costs associated with the capital of commuter rail was unique, and that they would still require the Virginia Railway Express to go through a performance-based program. And it's not highlighted here, but it is highlighted in their documents. But they would have a separate performance-based allocation that would still compete against everybody else, but it would be using different metrics. I pushed to try and do that for other things, and it did not happen. And honestly, a lot of this was concern about the burden of both data collection and then also the analytical side of things. So I know that DRPT was very sensitive to how much data and what would be the burden on transit agencies. And so, but that said, using one set of sizing metrics for 90% of our transit in the Commonwealth, I think is a very difficult thing to do.
Okay. Kate, at this point, we thank you for that. We don't have any questions that have been submitted.
Okay.
Wait a minute, as I speak. Okay. Okay. Has there been discussion or consideration for an agency who is projected to increase state funds with the final formula, but is projected to lose state funds during the transition year? All right, let me repeat that. Has there been discussion or consideration for an agency who is projected to increase state funds with the final formula, but is projected to lose state funds during the transition year? Yes.
So DRPT has talked about transition funding, but I think that is a really important question for somebody to ask DRPT and perhaps probe in comments. There's not a clear articulation of what funding DRPT could provide to anybody, honestly, during transition, but there has been they did share that's something they were investigating. So I would strongly suggest that transit agency provide comments to DRPT and reach out to DRPT to see what they're thinking in terms of transition.
Okay. All right. While we're waiting a moment to see if any other questions come in, I would take this moment to promote our VTA Legislative Advocacy Day, which is coming up in a few weeks on Monday, January 28th. We'll have our legislative briefing here at our office building at 10 a.m. and we'll talk about any legislation that's being introduced that pertains to transit or transit funding. And we encourage all of you to attend. Afterward, we'll send you forth to meet with your legislators over at the Pocahontas building or over at the Capitol. And later that afternoon, we'll once again host our Transportation Choices legislative reception at Main Street Train Station. Totally free of charge for our members because of the generosity of our sponsors to make that possible. So we just ask that you RSVP to Jamie at our office by January 18th if possible. At this point, Kate, I don't see any other questions that have been submitted. So if any of you think of something later, please submit it to me and I will get back to you or find the right response and get back to you as soon as possible. So we encourage you all to submit comments to DRPT, and we look forward to seeing you on January 28th. So thank you very much, Kate, for that informative webinar, and we hope that helps people understand the changes that are coming.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.